can keep going. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you for joining. I'm going to just jump straight back in, okay? ISSB, International Sustainability Standards Board. And we were a product, if you like, of the Glasgow COP 26 2 years ago, where after many, many years of fantastic innovation across the ecosystem by yourselves and business, by governments, by NGOs, we had a proliferation of standards and frameworks that came along in the market trying to address gaps and fill gaps that we needed out there to help us all meet the more ambitious sustainability challenges. And we all came together, a number of different frameworks and standards come together at COP26 to announce that the IFRS Foundation would be setting up the International Sustainability Standards Board. And the purpose of that was to harmonize the corporate reporting environment and making reporting on information to investors on sustainability issues much more efficient, effective, and provide much more decision useful information to the market. 2 years on from then, so 1 year on, last year, 2 years on, no, I'm getting all my years mixed up. That's how fast it's going. It's flying by. So last June, we launched our first 2 standards. Now, part of this whole consolidation was we had to start with climate change. So last June, we launched the first 2 standards, which are fondly known as S1 and S2, but don't worry about that. So the S1 standard is what we call the general requirements. It provides the how to report financially material, decision useful information to your investor via or connected to your annual report and accounts. That applies to all sustainability information. So just to flag that, all sustainability information and the how to. So it's quite broad, if you like. To go alongside that, we relaunched our second standard, S2, the climate standard. And that built directly off TCFD recommendations. So it brought the TCFD recommendations in, it brought the Climate Disclosure Standards Board's work in, and we created S2. So that's a really deep, detailed, if you like. So S1 cuts across the top, S2, climate standard, is much more detailed and much more deep. And that helps you report climate-related risks and opportunities to your investor, again, connected to your financial information alongside your annual report and accounts, or connected to or in, if you like. So these standards have been well received by the market. As I said, we put them out a year ago. We were not expecting the pace of change to be so fast in terms of regulatory adoption. We've got really strong signals here in the UK, but we also have really strong signals everywhere from Nigeria. I've got a Nigerian friend here in the audience. Kenya, right across Africa, Rwanda. We've got Chile, we've got Brazil, we've got Canada, we've got Australia, we've got Malaysia, we've got Singapore, we've got China. Japan, in fact, as well this week. We're really starting to see the tipping point across the world, moving from what was really a voluntary set of standards into a regulatory framework, creating what we hope is a global baseline of sustainability disclosures. So that level playing field for everyone to report information against, that in other jurisdictions where more is needed, like in Europe or here in the UK, for those in the panel before, on transition plans, incrementally add on, if you like, above that baseline. So we're still creating that globally, and I keep saying it, consistent, comparable data set that everyone will report. Now, we kicked off with climate, but we're not climate only. And so about a year ago, we started to consult and ask the market what we should do next. Now, we're a market-led organization. We ask the world, and everything we do, our standard setting, is in public. So you can watch it online, all our papers are online. There's a podcast at the end of every board week. So our board is a full-time working board working on technical standard setting. This isn't a governance board, this is a full-time technical working board. And at the end of every board week, which happens every month, there is a podcast about 15 minutes long that tells you what's discussed that week. I listen to that, that's how I find out what's going on. I don't listen to the board discussions all week. This is just a top tip. That's how you find out what's going on in the ISSB. Listen to the podcast at the end of the week. But that podcast, brings you up to speed with what is going on in our standard setting world. And so last year, we ran a consultation. We asked the market what we should do next beyond climate. And we had an overwhelming response. And over the last few months, the board have been having a chat about this. And just last week, they gave us a really clear signal of what's coming next. We will be working on biodiversity, ecosystems, and ecosystem services next, or the acronym is BEES. Kind of cool, right? Good comms work there. And the other one is human capital. So the 2 next big standard research projects, which may lead to standard setting, I should say. They're not committed to standard setting, but undertaking steps to see, what the investor need is and what actually might need to happen if we were to go down that route, building off existing reporting frameworks and standards in the market on those efforts. So a bit of the agenda that's going on. Yesterday, we launched our digital XBRL taxonomy for the climate standard. So that came out yesterday. Really exciting movement forward. We committed to digital first, and we've got our taxonomy out there. Those of you that don't know, financial information in this country is already required in a digital format to the regulator. So we want to make sure that we can do that, and in many jurisdictions around the world it is, or even in the US, it's all done using digital reporting. And now we've got that in place for climate, but that will be following for the rest of our standards as they go ahead. Tomorrow we launch our alignment table with Europe. So those that have been asking about what you're doing with Europe, that comes out tomorrow. Watch this space for that. We are also deeply committed to broader interoperability, and I'm sure Sue will talk about some of our efforts we've got together on that. And to support the market, we know this is not easy, and I do appreciate what I'm saying now is a very big snapshot of the work of the ISSB. It is a lot more complicated, a lot more than this. We do have a global capacity building program, which I head up for the International Sustainability Standards Board standards. And so we're running outreach activities right across the world. And we have a knowledge hub as well that supports preparers. We have 150 dedicated resources on there at the moment, some from ACCA, thank you so much. And that is there to get preparers started. There'll be e-learning there later this year. Really, because we know this is not necessarily easy to get everyone started and off the ground and running, and to provide you all with the sort of conversational knowledge you need around the standards to move forward. So watch out for that. It's, I think, Knowledge Hub IFRS / Knowledge Hub, I think, will bring you up to that place. So bookmark it and keep going back, because the resources there are truly fantastic to give you the introduction, to get you started. I'll stop there, and I can't wait for your questions. Sorry, that was a whirlwind.
No, thank you, Mardi. I think you managed to cover quite a lot in a short space of time, and she did give me a warning at the start not to let it get carried away, because it's too much to talk about. And I think a lot of the value will be driven from the questions that we get. I think actually I'm going to come to Sue next, based off the fact that we were talking about ISSB, and ask you about CDP. Maybe you could give a quick definition again for everybody in the room, but then also talk about the incorporation of S2 into your questionnaire and that sort of holistic perspective of what's going on there.
Okay, thanks very much. And I would just want to apologise to people sitting over here, because I feel I've got the choice of either looking at you or being able to see my moderator. And I would take a vote, but I think I probably should be able to see my moderator. So I'm really sorry, guys. I'm going to swivel as I go. I just want to do another check about knowledge levels about CDP, because it's often the case that we're not very visible. So can I just check who knows what CDP does in the room? Oh, that's really good. Okay, so I'll do a very brief summary then, if there's already a reasonable awareness level. So CDP is the global NGO that runs the global disclosure platform for corporate city-states, regions and financial institutions to disclose their environmental sustainability data. That's what we do. Last year we had 24,000 disclosures covering about 2/3 of market capitalisation, and we had a very high level of financial institutions involved, either requesting data or disclosing to us, and I have got a stat about that, worth more than a quarter of all global financial institution assets. So that's the scale that we're receiving disclosure on. Obviously that's not all. And as Mardi's just been saying, the more we can work together to have comprehensive standards and harmonisation, then the more easy it will be for more people to participate, and the better and more robust data we'll get, which is actually what's going to drive decisions that save the world. So we want the other half as well, but that's where we are at the moment. In terms of this year, we're really in a landmark year for implementation. We've had, as Mardi said, the climate standard, which CDP is working very, very closely with IFRS to ensure that we can align in our questionnaire. So the questionnaire that comes out in June this year for disclosure will mean that anyone disclosing against the climate questions in that will be disclosing in alignment with the ISSB climate standard, which is fantastic. It's a massive, big step forward towards a much more harmonised and consistent way of providing this key environmental data. So that's a crucial thing, but that's not the only thing that'll be new this year. We're also producing for the first time all of our disclosure opportunity for corporates in the form of an integrated questionnaire, rather than a separate questionnaire per environmental topic. And that's really important as well, because actually when you're in a business or a financial institution, you're not thinking slice by slice about the environment. You're thinking about your interaction with the environment, the risks, the opportunities, the exposure that you have, the dependencies and the impacts in the environment. So we've integrated our questionnaire so that that environmental interface can be seen as a holistic thing, with the key material data being disclosed to us. So that's another big step forward, big streamlining, massive reduction in the reporting burden, hopefully. And it allows us to build in a much more systematic way into the priority areas that you tell us that you want to have data about. So we've already got plastics and biodiversity there as pilot questions, but anyone can disclose against those if they're material. And we'll keep on examining our interface with another standard or framework, actually, the TNFD, which is going to allow us to systematically put in place disclosure opportunities for nature to sit alongside the fantastically well-developed climate standards. So that as we move forward, we'll end up with better and more robust and more comparable data that will be able to be used by financial institutions for investment decisions, by procurement leads for their supply chain management and so on. And that's where we're aiming. So we're aiming for that harmonised, systematic, consistent and comparable data set that everybody can use. It's really relevant, I think, for this event here in the UK because the forthcoming UK standard is obviously going to be based on ISSB, and actually in the CDP dataset last year, more than 1,600 UK companies are disclosing last year. And that's more than 90% of FTSE 100. So these are already very well prepared. They've been disclosing. They're going to be lined up with the new climate standards from this year onwards. So I think we're starting from a pretty good base as we go along. It's probably worth just thinking slightly about the future and where we might go, because of course it's not just the ISSB standard that's out there. We've also seen more regulation coming from other parts of the world, including the European requirements. There's emerging regulatory requirements in quite a few different jurisdictions across the world. And that's really important when you think about who's doing the disclosure and who's doing the investment, because quite often these companies are multinationals facing in all directions and affected by all of these requirements. They only get to disclose the CDP once, and the more we can ensure that the global baselines are built on, the more they can move to a write once, use many form for disclosure, which will massively help. Both in terms of data users and their decisions, but also in terms of the disclosures themselves, being able to disclose and then crack on with implementing the things that they're finding out as they go. There's a lot more I could say, but I'm getting twitched at. It's a good thing I face towards her, isn't it? So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hearing the discussion.
Yeah, I think that was really brilliant. And I think what we can take away is panelists trying to make your life as easy as possible. So probably we'll give them a round of thanks at the very end with that incorporation. Swaroop, I want to come to you now. We kind of touched on regulation and we've talked about sort of voluntary standards, well, voluntary frameworks like CDP, but we do have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and all of these standards and voluntary frameworks are interacting with jurisdictional sort of regulation as well. So if you could dive a little bit into that, and then perhaps if we have time, we can talk a bit more about transition frameworks as well.
Thank you very much, and I'm conscious that I wear two hats, and so I would want to bring industry view as well as practitioners' view on this topic. So just to set context and make it simple for the audience, because I've only been given 5 minutes on this difficult topic, is disclosure is not a burden. I mean, I think it's an opportunity for us to be able to tackle this challenge head on and be able to use it as an enabler, and that's how we view this, both at an industry level and as an organization. And I think what we have seen is quite a lot of progress over the years, including, and there are some very good examples in geographies. Actually, UK stands out as one of the very good examples on how the journey has been. And I see this as three streams converging. One is politics, second is policy, and third is practice. Now, if you really think of UK's journey, we really started with our ambition on net zero by 2050, moved into commitments of reduction of emissions by 2030 by 68%, then committed at the COP to make UK a financial center for net zero and etc. And finally made, committing to make transition plans mandatory for companies here. So from that stems, so that's the political part of it, the willingness to do it. And I know that's a debate we are not getting into here, but we have shown the willingness. The next step is really going into the policy action alongside. And what really was critical was the transition plan task force that was set up by UK, which is a very good example, which sort of interlinks with some of the standards my co-panelists were mentioning around ISSB, be it other standards in other jurisdictions, and also engaging with bodies like Financial Standards Board, NGFS and others, and set a baseline for transition planning for companies. Because I think what companies across the spectrum, large corporates, mid and small, are struggling with the whole idea of transition planning. And where do you start? Starting from the ambition of the company to really developing metrics to measure. So the TPT is a very good example of policy intervention to really set baselines around it and give guidance on how to develop transition planning. And then when you come to, as a result of some of these actions, look at practice, institutions have started adopting it. In fact, some of the front runners have already started publishing net zero transition plans, as you would see, including HSBC, which I'm very proud of. We have a very detailed plan which has sectoral views as well, which is one of the guidance which TPT has again issued. So if you see TPT guidance, they have recently issued earlier this month guidance around sectoral planning on transition plans. So that's something that we should incorporate. I think the key here is to really converge some of these standards, and that was mentioned previously as well. I think what we need really is ISSB or other standards coming together and converging on the mechanisms, so not creating divergent mechanisms for companies or practitioners to follow. And again, there is some very good work happening on industry level, not just on standards, even on collaboration, and we have seen that both at the GFANs as well as in some of the industry initiatives that we are leading, where we are looking at metrics which are developed commonly by corporates. For example, one of the initiatives that we are collaborating is with Apparel Impact Institute, where we are working with them on textile and garment value chains to develop metrics for reportable parameters for suppliers to create value chain sustainability. Now, this is a topic which has been at the heart of discussion for many years with different brands, but it's the first time we are coming together on a pre-competitive basis to be able to develop standards which can be implemented. So I think the answer lies in convergence, and answer lies in the fact that CSRD or ISSB standards all are converging towards our transition journey, and it's a journey we are on and should not be seen as a burden, is my view, both as a practitioner as well as at an industry level. So that's the starting position I would like to place, and very happy for questions later on.
Amazing. Thank you, Swaroop. I didn't even have to give a warning. It did exactly 5 minutes. It's the first time it's ever happened. But I think that was really, really useful to gain that sort of perspective. And I think it's important to recognise as well that we're talking about ISSB, we're talking about CSRD, but ISSB have come out very strongly with people like EFRAG, and you are working together across all of those boards globally. These things aren't happening in isolation, and that's important to remember. Everybody is working together, and it does give a real show of confidence to investors and to the market that things will be consistent and we will create that global baseline as a whole. Finally, I'm going to come to Mark. You can perhaps touch on the importance of sort of mandatory versus voluntary, and then how we sort of look beyond climate and look towards action as well.
Great, thank you so much. I'll come back to the aspect of convergence and burden, etc. on the business, but I'll come back in a minute. So first of all, UK Business Biodiversity Forum, very briefly, we're a business forum recently established to help businesses understand biodiversity, what it actually means, and get them to integrate biodiversity in decision making. So that's a little bit about the forum. So I just want to take it back to real basic principles before I go into talk about disclosures and the requirements there. First of all, and we all know this, but actions on climate and nature are intrinsically interlinked. You can't separate the two. And one thing that's been great the last couple of days here is seeing nature really coming through on the theme here, and we're starting to see that through the integration of what's happening here as well. So really great to see that. On the back of that, action on climate and action on nature by businesses is critically important. They need to be doing both in order to get to net zero. All businesses, and some people get challenged in this, all businesses have an impact on biodiversity, whether it's directly, indirectly, large or small, so they need to be taking actions, and all businesses need to be taking that action in order to get the transformative change which is needed to get to recover nature loss by 2030, reverse the loss of nature by 2030 and full recovery by 2050. So there's a lot of work going on in that space, what that business need to be doing. So disclosures. First of all, I think generally, of course, businesses welcome transparency. Transparency is critically important if governments, financial institutions, and consumers, which we often aren't in this discussion, can make the right decisions for consumerism or production, etc. So really getting the information out there so people can make the right decision behind it. Businesses certainly generally support the idea of mandatory disclosures, but they need to be, we've had on several discussions in the last couple of days here, and they need to be the right type of mandatory requirements. There's good legislation and there's bad legislation, and sometimes they can have unintentional consequences between them. Now for nature, of course, we have the TNFD, which you've already heard about, which is great to see. Also, we see mirroring the CSRD, sort of pigeons flying around, the biodiversity coming in at the moment. Obviously, we're seeing TNFD hopefully being integrated into the ISSB, so it's great to see the ISSB taking the lead and incorporating nature into that. And obviously, we wait to see how the UK government is going to be aligning with the ISSB I think it's in July time when it comes out, so we'll see an aspect on that. At the same time, of course, we have the EU and the CSRD, which we mentioned, which is mandatory for many companies, which just creates already quite a complex space. TNFD, TCFD, ISSB, for business coming into the space, it is quite complicated to understand how they interlink to each other. So very much welcome that convergence and what it's trying to achieve. But first of all, just remember the purpose of the disclosure mechanisms is to drive change in business strategies and plans, and to, ideally for nature anyway, to shift the financial flows from negative impacts on biodiversity to positive impacts. So that's the mechanism by which disclosures are we're trying to achieve. And I think there's 2 or 3 key challenges here which have been highlighted already for businesses. We talk about a level playing field for regulations and making it mandatory. Absolutely, and that's the key purpose behind regulations, to provide that level playing field. But for disclosures, that doesn't always provide that level playing field. And to explain that, if you look at, for example, ESRS requirements, they are complicated. They are challenging, and the way different businesses will interpret those requirements will vary. Whether it's materiality assessment, whether it's resilience analysis, or defining some of the terms within ESRS. So the more standardization we can get around those, the better. So making comparison between company to company or sector to sector is going to be extremely difficult, at least initially. But this is part of a journey, and hopefully there will be increasing convergence about those common approaches going forward. I think the other aspect is which I have a bit of a concern about, is in terms of, is there too much of a focus on disclosures? Businesses have relatively limited resources. Are they shifting too many of their resources to disclosure and reporting against disclosures rather than focusing on action and commitments? And getting that balance right is really important, because it's action what we need for climate and nature, rather than just reporting for reporting's sake. There is a risk that disclosure becomes a tick box exercise, and it isn't driving the action which it's tending to do. Business for Nature has this very simple framework: act, commit, transform, and disclose. Disclose is the end, act is at the beginning. And this is where we're trying to push businesses to be acting on nature. Yes, disclosure is important and going to be required, but focus on the act and the commit first of all, and that's the key piece. And this is why also Swaroop was highlighting, I think getting nature and of course climate into transition plans is really important, because it's those transition plans which I think will actually drive action within the business themselves. And then the last point is really just that consistency across jurisdictions in terms of how jurisdictions apply it. We've mentioned that already. Hopefully there's increasing convergence around that space as well. So anyway, that's my few points to take home.
That's wonderful and well timed as well. We do have quite a few questions. One of them, which has been upvoted quite a lot, is what are the penalties if companies don't comply with disclosure standards now and in the future? I think it's important to say that there are mandatory and voluntary standards and frameworks. So when you're looking at what you're reporting against, please double check, don't get them intermixed. And someone can jump in at any point with me on this, but when we're talking about ISSB and adoption, that's the jurisdictions adopting the ISSB for their own sort of regulatory purposes. So ISSB as a whole, you correct me if I'm wrong, Mardi, doesn't have its own sort of regulatory body. It's not penalties associated with it. It is the standard to be implemented by jurisdictions. Does anybody else want to jump in on that one? Yep, Sue?
Thanks. I think this is a brilliant question. I don't know who asked it. Obviously, when a standard is or a requirement to disclose is put into law in any particular jurisdiction, then there'll be whatever penalties that apply there for failing to follow the rules, which could be fines or whatever. But I think the more important question here is, what are the penalties incurred by the business for not engaging in the world of disclosure, not in a legal sense? So we see 3 use cases for disclosure: access to capital, business resilience, and being able to demonstrate compliance, so you get it in compliance ready. And the companies that don't participate are not necessarily the ones who are doing best in other ways as well. So, for example, our A-listers, who are excellent disclosers, outperform their financial benchmark by 6% year on year for the last decade. These are the companies that are doing really well because they're taking the disclosure, taking the learning, applying the learning, using it to benchmark themselves, building up much more resilient supply chains, much more resilient investor relationships, and benefiting from that. Data is power, as well as a burden. I think your point, Mark, about it's not just a burden is really important here. This is a hygiene measure for doing business in the modern world now. It's not just an annoying thing that you have to do and a bit of paperwork. It's intelligence to make your business flourish, and that's a really crucial point. Thank you.
Happy to add, again, business lens to this, because we see this question quite often from clients across various developing and developed countries as well. I think the answer to this is really, lies in one of the concepts of disclosure of double materiality. That do you see this as a need to disclose, or do you see this as a need for your business to be resilient for the future? I think that's the conversation we are having increasingly with clients and value chain players, because disclosure will drive measurement will drive progress, and as a result, you will drive resilience. I think that's the conversation we are having. And developing more resilient value chains is the need of corporate world globally. It's not just here. So I think that's the way the conversation has to shift. But of course, there would be penalties and others as this goes into law in various geographies. And one of the examples you will see is hopefully in the UK, when it legislates around ISSB related law in coming months, hopefully. Yeah.
Great. I think Mardi might jump in as well.
And just to say that we are seeing, these are standards that our standards in particular are enforced by the financial regulators, right? So I think that's important. This isn't an environmental regulated thing. This is a financially regulated set of standards. And we are seeing enforcement agencies around the world upskilling now. So these are things that, we know Europe are going to pull out a sample of a couple of hundred this year. We know the UK, when I merged my old organisation to the IFRS Foundation, the UK government, the FRC here, took some of my staff so they got ready to start thinking about enforcing these standards as they come in, into law here. So this isn't sustainability disclosure as you once knew it, perhaps in a voluntary world. This is a very different level of controls around your information, a very different level of sign-off from the top. And I'm not trying to scare anyone here, but these aren't standards of a voluntary world anymore. These are compliance standards, and you need to get the buy-in from the top all the way down.
Yeah, an important message. Thank you, Mardi. And I think I might stick with you, because we do, don't look too disappointed, because we do have another question, which is, you might not be able to answer, and other people do feel free to jump in. But what are the reasons you're seeing for jurisdictions not being able to adopt new standards or implement them? And there's probably a bit of a divide there between global north and global south as well, and business and financial flows.
But actually, we are seeing the global south come in on this, right? They are familiar. So the IFRS Foundation, we have accounting standards in just under 150 countries around the world. There are mechanisms in 150 countries around the world to bring in IFRS standards. In many countries, that's the equivalent of the ICAW here in the UK that brings them in. They've already got delegated powers, and it's quite a simple movement. And in many ways, in the global south, it's much easier to bring the standards in because they don't already have a modern slavery statement requirement. They don't already have a requirement for some parts of climate. And here in the UK, we've got the challenge. We're already actually quite good. We have TCFD. We have to unpick some of that enabled to bring the other bits in. But in the global south, they can cut and paste and move much more quickly in many ways. And it's a really great way. We're talking about access to capital here in a way as well, right? They're familiar with IFRS standards. They're familiar with the way to bring them into their economies. They're familiar with the mandates to bring them in, and they can move. And I think the benefit of mandatory standards, particularly in the global south, is it means that they're producing the same information. They're just as transparent. They can attract that capital from the global north to invest in their companies and their countries and move that money faster to that transition we need. So there were real benefits. And actually, we struggle more where there's already regulation because you've got to unpick that to bring it in.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else want to jump in?
I can add to this because we see a lot of this because of our footprint. Again, we actually see it. Companies are adopting this. And there are two types of challenges. One, simplicity of frameworks and how do you implement them. So the point that I was laboring in the first answer, that we need frameworks for implementation and convergence. I think that's the first challenge. But we have actually seen some forward movement from some developing countries. Bangladesh is a very good example, which has really adopted one of the first countries to adopt standards here. So I think it's not correct in saying global south is not adopting. I think the challenge is for us to make the standards consistent and converge them together and be able to bring out frameworks which are implementable. and which is why transition planning is quite an important tool to integrate some of these standards into your transition planning and metrics that you would like to measure.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you. No, I agree with the colleagues here, but just the reflections there, and this may be why it's slightly different from climate from nature. I just remember going back to the COP15 negotiations around CPD, because they originally planned that there's going to be mandatory reporting requirements under Target 15. That got pushed out by a lot of the Global South countries because they haven't got the resources to put it in place. It's as simple as that, and they have other priorities. So it is a challenge. Maybe it's slightly different for climate, for nature.
That's really helpful, thank you. You have to excuse me constantly looking down. I can't read and look at the same time. I'm slightly challenged in that sense. But there have been a couple of upvotes on what are the key reporting challenges of major banks in terms of financed emissions. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that one.
Yeah, I think in terms of, I think it's the scale of data that's required for us to be able to disclose, and it's not just banks, it's also our clients, which are, so the challenge for us is availability of data, and then being able to do it in the certain timeline. I think that's been the challenge, but we have stated our emissions data, runway. We have produced net zero transition plan earlier this year, and it has sectoral pathways that we have put together. So I think that's the way to go, and I always keep saying this at the industry forums, that let perfect not be the enemy of good in this, because I think we all know we are faced with a challenge which is multidimensional, and we have to be able to make progress to over perfection here, and I think that's the way we are looking at it from an industry lens. And I think the challenge, if you ask me, is really getting data from hard-to-abate sectors, moving some of the countries which are slightly behind on this topic. I think those are the usual ones which we foresee.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And I think another one that we've had is about sustainability data and how it could be often unaligned and unstructured, and what are the opportunities and challenges that AI and things like ChatGPT, what could they bring to the ecosystem? I wonder if Sue could come to you in terms of sort of the data collection aspect that CDP offers, and how you sort of do that questionnaire nowadays as well.
Well, I probably ought to manage expectations here a bit. I cannot tell you how ChatGPT is going to help. I can tell you that so CDP collects metric data, and we also collect text data, which allows companies to put in more information than we've asked a specific question about, which can be really rich and really interesting, but really hard to analyse and compare. So we've already got that challenge. We've looked at it in particular to explore whether it could help us to improve our scoring approach, because at the moment that's very manual. We read it all, believe it or not. We read 24,000 submissions. It's actually really difficult to pull out comparable data using machine learning software on those text boxes. We can't really do it in a way that we're confident with at the moment. The technology might be able to develop, and we might be able to get more from that rich text-based data, but at the moment we are using metric data fully because of the limitations of AI. In terms of the need for alignment and inconsistent information that's available for particularly in the nature space, I think that was focused there. This is behind, and it is much more complex. We're not just measuring one type of impact on the natural world in nature, where it's multidimensional, and it's very context and location specific in a way that climate information is not. So we're dealing with a much more complex landscape of information to collect. And our approach, rather than going down the AI route, is to try to construct the disclosure platform in a way that could be as consistent and well aligned and integrated as possible, focusing only on the questions that make the difference rather than all the data we could possibly collect, so that we can end up with a robust and decision-ready set of comparable data. So that's our solution for now, but I do say for now because I do think there's a future for some of this AI-enabled data collection and interpretation as well. It just doesn't exist on the CDP platform yet.
Perfect, brilliant. And there's actually a quote I have from ACCA roundtable we had once, which is report on what matters, not on what's measurable. And I think we can easily get caught up in just all the data that there is available. Mardi, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, from a digital perspective and thinking about AI, I mentioned earlier about our digital XBRL reporting taxonomy that came out yesterday. That makes the information discoverable, if you like. So if you run that through and you search AI, all of this information will come out. So it will make reports much more, information in reports much more, scrapable, if you like, from the internet. But with that tagging means the information that's scraped is, the information you want it to be, rather than the broader story that might be scraped about you. So, using this tagging, it will also help lower the burden for companies, because you can tag right through your internal systems, right through to the output that goes to the regulator, if you like, for them to access the data. Which means that if your rating agency comes along, they're going to scrape that right number and know it's got the controls around it, rather than what might be a number that's somewhere else in the story. So there is a real role, I think, in the future, and I think this digital tagging is going to increase the consistency, comparability, and rigor of that data, rather than scraping everything in the future. But there's some really great papers out there. Just Google this, like XBRL and AI, and not even on climate, and it does sort of help you talk you through this story.
You might Google it and end up with too much reading.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. Use your ChatGPT function to search it and give you the answer.
See how much time you have on your hands. I think we've got another question that's quite popular, which is, Mark, you mentioned the importance of action as well as reporting, and how do we integrate them effectively? And this is quite difficult. Does reporting metrics in common monetary units have a role? And I think that's something that perhaps everybody could make a comment on. But should we stick with the first one first, which is how we integrate them effectively, reporting and action?
Great question. I think it worked. I'm not sure unless you got the answer to that one, but anyway, no. I think in terms of reporting on the actions you're taking and proving you're actually putting those actions in place is critical. So, but in terms of performance and tracking, how businesses are actually implementing the things they're disclosing is really important. So, but in terms of that aspect of it, I think on the UK is probably a bit unusual in terms of the regulations there, because you've got the biodiversity net gain requirements driving action, but it's just linking those together. I think it was important. So, not too sure, but in terms of just obviously under ESRS and TNFD, they do ask you to report on the actions your business are taking and the resources behind them. So it's basically just monitoring and ensuring that those things are actually being undertaken. So I suppose it comes then down to accounting.
Brilliant, thank you.
Purposes, yeah.
I think come to Mardi and then Sue on the end as well wants to jump in.
From our perspective at the IFRS Foundation, and I'd say this without my IFRS hat on as well, is reporting's the thing you do to tell your story, right? It tells the story of all the good action that comes before that. If you want to go back to the business and biodiversity example, it's just telling your story and giving you the framework to tell that story in a way that's accessible for the key stakeholder or the regulatory requirement that you need to tell. And, I think if you pick up a standard or a framework before you actually think about what story you want to tell, you're always going to be led by the wrong thing. Really think about your business. Now, it can help, think about other things that might be important to stakeholders and definitely inform it. But, think about what your story to tell and what's then required and out there to help you tell it.
Thanks. I don't want to go over that ground because it's really well made by previous panellists, but I want to push back very gently against this idea that it's either disclosure or action. Then they don't trade off quite that simply. In fact, we've got quite a few pieces of evidence that show that the more disclosure is engaged with, the more action follows. So happy to see nods. But it is all part of embedding information and thinking and intention and strategy and delivery into the business, and not treating an environmental strategy as an extra separate thing, but as a core de-risking element of a central business strategy. So just a couple of little examples there. You mentioned transition plans. Back in 2021, CDP came up with a definition of a credible transition plan, which is something that has targets and is properly embedded and will deliver against recognisable goals. At the point we launched that idea, there were just 1,500 companies that had a credible transition plan, and that increased once we put it out there and started saying we are going to notice. It increased 400% in 2 years. The quality of the transition planning shot up when the disclosure started focusing on it. That's one. Companies that have disclosed consistently on water for a decade have reduced their water withdrawals way more than those who started recently. That's another one. Multinationals engaging their suppliers to disclose quality data are driving more emissions cuts through their value chains than those that are just starting to think about it. There's so many examples of this. It really is true that what gets measured gets managed. So I would really hate anyone to think that disclosure is a burden that reduces delivery efforts. I don't think that it's quite that simple.
I would like to add to that. I think that's where I started. That disclosure is not a burden, but an enabler. And we have seen many examples. For example, in the area that I work, we have seen sustainable supply chain financing being linked to metrics related to disclosure. And Europe has Supply Chain Due Diligence Act and others coming in, which increases disclosure on supply chains for companies, which we're using to develop supply chain financing programs. Another example of this is we have collaborated with WWF and WRI as part of our Climate Solutions Partnership to develop a model for measuring regenerative agricultural practices using palm oil. And it's a regenerative agriculture palm oil framework which basically outlines metrics to use to measure soil health and other parameters to classify a particular financing linked to particular plantation as regenerative financing. So that sort of tools are enabling companies to adopt metrics and create reporting for them to be able to report for sustainable food.
That's not the Oscars music.
Sorry.
We're not quite done yet, so hopefully it won't go on for more than a sort of minute or so. But
Those are some examples of
There we go.
how metrics are driving adoption.
brilliant, thank you. Okay, well, I don't know when the music will end, so we'll just carry on. I think talking about the sort of opportunity piece and the positivity piece, ACCA just did hold some sort of informal interactions amongst members, and we found that everybody was saying that it is an opportunity for accountants as well. It's a real career opportunity. It's how we develop our own critical thinking and judgment and mindset. So I think a lot of disclosure is taken with sort of a negative point of view sometimes, because it is an additional burden and it does require upskilling, but we have to think about that in the long term and how much of an opportunity that is for our businesses to grow and thrive and generate more positive impacts in the economy. And so I suppose the final question that we have time to ask is probably, and everyone can jump in on this one, but how do we ensure that capital actually flows towards positive impact given all the disclosures that are required? Let's go first.
I think, again, don't want to repeat the points that I made, but really it's dependent on creating measurable parameters to direct capital, and collaboration is the second big piece. We have been working quite heavily with multiple players in the industry, not just data providers and others, but in the finance sector, because there's a lot of innovation needed in how we finance some of these products and solutions. I spoke about sustainable supply chain financing, which is a beautiful solution for value chain transition. There could be other examples on going further with these suppliers for example, we are working with companies to implement CAPEX, capital expenditure financing solutions for sustainable transition or energy efficiency solutions in the value chain. So that's something that we are working with multilateral banks to bring in together, sort of risk-sharing partnerships. We are also working with some of the external institutions to develop a blend of financing, not just looking at one or a particular supplier, but a portfolio of suppliers. And can we really create a portfolio solution for a scaled, dispersed value chain solution with first loss and senior financing type of structures? So there are various types of innovation that are needed in structuring, partnership on blended finance, and also looking at enabling tools to be provided to some of our clients, similar to what I spoke about on transition plan frameworks, where clients are really asking us as financiers to really guide them on how they can implement some of these tools to enable capital flows into their value chain. So I think it's not one straight answer, it's a combination of things that you do. Bring finance, bring in partners, and bring in the tools that are required to enable finance being channeled.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I think Sue wants to jump in. These might be our final remarks as each panellist kind of jumps in here as we do start to wrap up. But
Okay.
Thank you.
So I don't have the answer here at all because I think, it's, as you said, it's a really complex question, but I do have some really interesting things from the CDP database, which is, it all goes down to this point. I think it was McKinsey a few years ago produced a stat that said $1.50 in the world economy is spent sustainably, which means the other 49 are not. So that's the challenge. It's to direct the economy to be producing environmental outcomes and protecting ecosystem services. And at the moment, while we're doing this heavy lifting on the side and we're finding pennies to do philanthropy and we're trying to invent products and rely on innovation, we're not getting above that 1 in 50 thing fast enough. A third of European corporates disclosing through us last year said access to capital is a key concern for decarbonisation projects. But that against it, we've got 95% of FIs who are disclosing have climate change in their business strategies. So I think that'll feed through. We need nature to follow it. It's way, way, way behind. And the one point I'd want to make here is that I think we really have to discern who needs to do what. So there's definitely a massive job for the financial sector to ensure that capital is flowing to the right things, but there's also a job surrounding that for governments to take action to support it, because there is a bit of a flip-flop going on at the moment. I think the UK is trying to challenge itself quite a lot, but it's not always the case. That there does need to be a regulatory floor that supports action and enabling policies for the leaders, so that these innovation points and the leading investors can be very successful and break down the barriers for others to follow. And I'm not sure that we've really got that nailed at the moment.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think we are coming to the end, so I think both Mark and Mardi want to jump in. I'll let Mardi go first because she made eye contact first, and then Mark.
Very quickly,
patiently waiting.
I think first of all, in terms of there's fantastic innovation in the space, in terms of moving forward, and a lot of different initiatives and integration going on. To crux of it, I think the key one that comes back to your place, Sue, is in terms of investors. Mainstream investors have to change the way they are investing their funds, because at the moment we're not seeing that change, including in the climate side of things, but also within the nature side. And they need to see, rightly or wrongly, a return on investment in order to make that shift. And then at another moment, they're basically investing in activities which are not necessarily climate or nature positive, but that's the way. So we have to change that model of investment to make it sure they do get that return on investment on a more sustainable process.
Thank you, Mark. Mardi? Oh.
I'll get that right. Disclosure and reporting, as Mark said earlier, is really all about transparency, right? And we need that transparent information in the global south to help move that money. Now, there is a huge role in here. We heard from governments, but the governments need the support often of the development banks and others to give them that confidence that their own capacity building, if you like, in their governments to help them understand how to bring standards and reporting frameworks and other infrastructure in that is going to really help to support this transition. Now, there's lots of great signs out there, but there's a lot of work to be done there. And we're working hard. We're training regulators. We're working with the development banks, but it is going to take years. But we shouldn't lose our eye on the prize. Take our eye off the prize here. Sorry, if you like. This is really about making the information available, so that when the investors are ready and have their right sort of the mindset in place, they can compare, the UK with India, the UK with Nigeria, the UK with others, and actually work out where the best investment is going to be against all of their factors. And hopefully, the transition is part of that, and we can start to really see those flows of capital that we need to see with the pace we need to see them to meet our 2030 and 2050 targets.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I think it's been a really insightful discussion. I think our panellists could have talked all night about this, so there was a little bit of time pressure, but thank you very much. I think some key takeaways here are that what we've discussed a lot is talking about sustainability as a holistic piece rather than just focusing on climate, and hopefully everybody's taken that away, and we've also taken away the sort of jurisdictional, regulatory, mandatory, voluntary aspects of reporting and how important disclosure is for driving action. So I think a round of applause for our panellists, and thank you very much.